Hello, and welcome to NPM's inaugural Interconnections Renewable Energy Professional Forum. My name is Alana Knopp, Senior Reporter with NPM, and we're thrilled to have you all join us today. Over the last several months, the renewable energy sector has gotten a major boost from the Biden administration's promised public investment of $400 billion over 10 years in clean energy technologies and innovation. To put that into context, that investment in today's dollars is twice the investment of the Apollo program that put a man on the moon. In other words, we are on the cusp of a clean energy revolution. We're privileged to be joined today by a panel of top talent in the renewable energy space to find out how they are preparing their companies to take advantage of this anticipated growth. First, I'd like to welcome Johana Afenjar, Senior Director of Capital Markets at Clearway Energy. Johana leads fundraising of debt and equity to support Clearway's business and has been instrumental in shaping the company's finance function, as well as building its teams and culture. We're also joined by Benjamin Baker, Managing Director of Greenbacker Development Opportunities Fund, who leads the origination and execution of Greenbacker's development capital and private equity investments. Ben brings deep experience across the renewable energy industry, having held positions in both development and private equity. We have Richard DeVere, Chief Investment Officer at EDP Renewables Distributed Generation, where he leads capital investment and overall market strategy for the platform's more than $500 million portfolio of operating and development assets. Rich has more than a decade of experience developing, structuring, and financing award-winning renewable power generation projects in the United States and Europe. And Will Mitchell, Vice President for Business Development in the Western United States for Strata Clean Energy. Will is responsible for commercial and development activities, as well as policy initiatives and public affairs, all in support of Strata's solar and storage projects. Thank you all for being here. We're really excited to have you launch this inaugural panel, and we would love to start off with each of you giving a brief overview of your company, as well as your company's latest efforts as we move further into 2021. So Ben, can we start this off with you?
Greenbacker as a firm is about 10 years old. The firm got its start with a view towards democratizing investment in sustainable infrastructure, meaning the first vehicle that they formed was it raises retail capital, so you could put part of your retirement account into a solar farm or a wind farm, and so that's how they historically have been raising money, and that fund has now grown to well over $1 billion over the past few years. And then about a year ago, I joined to launch GDEV, which still works in the same ecosystem of regional renewable energy developers, sustainable infrastructure developers, but we provide more flexible, typically corporate level capital to developers. So as a firm, we are very active, I would say, in sort of the middle market of renewable energy development and infrastructure across the U.S.
That's great. Thank you, Ben. And let's turn to Rich now.
EDPR, North America Distributed Generation, is a new part of EDPR. EDPR is globally is the fourth largest owner of wind power in the world and one of the largest owners of renewables in the United States. The distributed generation endeavor is a new part of that strategy, which came as a consequence of an acquisition of a company that I had co-founded 6 years ago called C2 Energy Capital. We brought a portfolio of operating assets and development assets and a team over, and now we are part of executing with the benefits of the resources of EDPR a much broader distributed generation strategy in the U.S. That includes a growth plan of targeting over 300 megawatts a year of new distributed generation.
Great. Thank you, Rich. And now we'll turn to Will.
Thanks for having us. Strata is really emblematic of the growth of the solar industry. The company has been around for a little over a decade, but started doing small rooftop jobs and then gradually grew into small ground mount projects and then larger ground mount projects. And now today, our company is responsible for the largest solar project east of the Mississippi in Virginia. And then we just brought online one of the largest standalone battery storage projects in the US, 100 megawatt, 400 megawatt hour project out in California that's going to be serving resource adequacy for Southern California Edison for the next 20 years. And so we're family owned still, which is something we're very proud of. We've got a portfolio from coast to coast, recently just received some additional development capital. And so we're looking at growth, meeting all the opportunities that are being created by the Biden administration, and then just generally the growth driven by the pure economics of renewables. So really happy to be here and talk more about that today.
Thank you so much, Will. Appreciate that. And Johana.
For having us. So Clearway started about 8 years ago, and I've been with the company for 7 years. I was one of the first batch of employees back then. We are a renewable energy company, one of the biggest in the United States, and we are a developer of wind, solar, and storage. So we have a pipeline of about 10 gigawatts. And through our affiliate, which is publicly traded, CWEN, we are owner of about 5 gigawatts of projects, and we manage them and we also operate those projects. So our mission is to provide clean energy to our customers. And help bring all of us to a world where we're 100% clean energy. So this is our mission. I'm sure we'll talk about that and how it fits into current legislative changes. And in terms of what we're kind of doing right now into 2021, we're focusing on new geographies. We're present nationwide, and we are creating forays into new states. So West Virginia, for example, we're the first wind producer there, and obviously new technology as well through storage.
That's great. Thank you, Johana. And so I'll stay with you if I may. I'd like to ask you how Clearway is positioning itself ahead of this major anticipated, renewable energy growth, especially in relation to the Biden administration's infrastructure plan.
Yeah, sure. So at Clearway, we support the American Jobs Plan and the goal to 100% clean energy. This is our mission. So the plan supports our mission, and we support the plan. We have a 10 gigawatt pipeline. So features of the plan will help us accelerate when we develop this pipeline. Specifically, there's features in the plan such as enhancements and extensions of credits towards renewables that will help us develop our pipeline. And we're positioned as well through being very active in the legislation process. So there's the plan, and now there's how we implement the plan, how we make it practical and something that's going to be implemented. So we're very active in that as well, and participating in the legislative process to make this plan happen.
That's actually really interesting to hear you talk about, your kind of connection with policy. And Ben, I'm wondering if you can kind of expand on that a little bit and talk about, not only how Greenbacker is preparing itself, in relation to the Biden infrastructure plan, but also kind of, what you're looking at as far as, maybe policies within that plan.
Yeah, no, happy to speak about that. I joined here under the prior administration, and probably sometime around last October, November, again, we're kind of actively fundraising still. And so I was pitching the fund, as if that administration would have a second term, So for me, I still come to work and do probably what I would have been doing, albeit with, I think, a lot more regulatory tailwind than we would have otherwise had. We see a lot of great legislation coming out of states, whether that's Virginia and the Clean Energy Act or other markets that we're starting to enter. And so a lot of it's always been state driven, and we still focus on that. So again, it's kind of a non-answer because, we don't look to federal policy to guide what we're doing. I think what we saw coming into probably last year, as we were talking about launching this fund, was the economics of renewables and really the capital inflows into ESG focused funds, and really the climate and other ESG just demands on behalf of the investment community. And we really see that as driving the future here. And so, we already had an eye towards, hey, we have a vehicle that is a buyer of assets, but we need a vehicle that is backing the seller of assets too, that is backing development, just as the pace of development is set to explode. And again, we saw that happening from a mix of sources, from state legislation to the economics of the technologies, to just the general demands of investors, as I said. So I would say it's less policy driven, but the timing is the same. And so we're sitting here wanting to make sure that we drive the pace of new development, and we finance that development activity in addition to coming into projects that are at NTP or later. So I think that's how we're thinking of it, at least in the life cycle of project development and project finance. And then, of course, I think we have an eye towards what's next. We've spent, when I say we, Greenbacker, before I got here, but the company spent a decade creating a name and creating expertise and a machine in solar and wind and lately batteries. But if you look at what's next, whether it's hydrogen, carbon capture, electric vehicles charging and fleet electrification, just grid resiliency generally with a mix of batteries, transmission upgrades, and otherwise, I think we're thinking about what's next. We're thinking about how to support not just renewable generation, but grid resiliency, and how our aging kind of infrastructure accepts or adapts to the intermittency of the generation. So that's where our head's at, is both being in the corner of developers while still providing long-term infrastructure capital, and then having an eye towards what's next technologically, and again making sure that the grid and the infrastructure of the U.S. can handle everything that we're doing to it.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. Thank you. And Rich, obviously you're very deeply involved in distributed generation at EDPR. So I'd love to hear from you how EDP is getting ready of this huge growth, and of course looking at the infrastructure plan.
Yeah, I mean, look, EDPR is really becoming the driving force of the EDP engine generally, and there's a massive growth plan, massive multi-gigawatt growth plan that exists from the EDPR global standpoint, of which DG in North America and DG globally is a part of. Ultimately, like Ben, I mean, we saw the greatest growth at the predecessor company during the Trump administration, and that I don't view that as a consequence of the Trump administration. I view it as a consequence of the policies that came prior to that. And I think that ultimately, as the infrastructure plan goes, that momentum is already there. So EDP are relative to through the DG lens. We go from being a smaller scale developer into a platform that has a substantial government affairs capability. In fact, one of the individuals who's on the management committee of the DG team is actually the head of government affairs for North America. And what we are really seeing is an attitude around distributed generation that it is enabling more of the thinking around creative utility scale projects, developments, structures, rather than it being sort of at at a loggerhead. And so ultimately, the infrastructure plan we think will encourage more thinking around how to do renewables creatively, and to, as we go to this phase that is beyond the low hanging fruit, with the Walmarts of the world or the large utility scale PPAs, where people have to think more dynamically. And I think it extends, in fact, even beyond just the infrastructure plan. I think it extends to the attitude of the administration generally. The appointment of Jigar Shah to the head of the DOE loan guarantee office is another example of that, where some of it is going to be done through congressional policy, and some of it is going to be done through the tone that the administration puts out of that this is a priority. And we're very excited about that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And Will, same question to you, but obviously from the kind of solar and storage perspective, how are you looking at all of this?
Absolutely. So echoing what everyone has said in terms of getting through the challenges of the Trump administration, most of these firms, if not all of them, were well on their way during the Obama administration, and then so Trump came in, and I think the states really responded, both from a regulatory process and a legislative process, as well as just the economics of the market, kept things moving during the Trump administration. And where things got complicated, the Trump administration had to do with his macro approach to globalization and supply chain. And that's really, I think, where the industry was able to weather some really big challenges, because this is a global industry. We have global supply chains, and there was a lot of concern around that with the trade case for solar, and wind dealt with similar issues. But now, there's clearly, it's really nice to have an administration that is pro-renewable, and also a Congress that is pro-renewable. There's a mention of the tax credits. There's three pieces of legislation, or excuse me, two pieces of legislation working their way through, one in the House, one in the Senate. Both would extend solar and wind tax credits, would also include battery energy storage into the tax credits. Transmission would be eligible for tax credits. There's potential hydrogen, carbon reduction tax credits. So there's a lot of, there's proven tax incentives that are looking to be extended for quite a period of time, which is absolutely just going to ensure that the Biden plan or state RPSs, or just generally the transition, continues in a really aggressive manner. And so we're incredibly excited about it. It's not to say that there's not challenges across the industry, particularly around interconnection. There was a really interesting report that came out of the federal level, Lawrence Berkeley Lab, a couple of weeks ago, just talking about how the grid is just at a, not a breaking point, but just so congested that it's really delaying the country's progress toward clean energy solutions, because there's just not enough pipes and wires to move power around, move clean energy around, move electrons. So I think we need to see a lot more investment in that, whether it's directly from the utilities or independent developers, but we clearly need more transmission, so all our companies are able to realize these projects that we're bringing to the fore. And most importantly, we got to continue to be competitive. There's battery storage costs are going to continue to come down as manufacturing ramps up. Solar costs are astoundingly low. Probably see some leveling there. I'm not sure they can actually go much lower, but clearly beating out natural gas as an alternative, particularly when you integrate wind and battery storage and solar and battery storage, and can provide that firm resource that can really serve those long-term capacity challenges that you're seeing. So overall, it's fantastic to have the support on the federal level, also support on the state level. But at the end of the day, as the industry continues to scale, our economics get better and better, and we become more competitive, and we get smarter with what we do, and we'll all win more RFOs, and that's good for the planet, and it's good for bringing carbon down, and it's good for consumers.
Yeah, it sounds like we're in a good place as far as renewable energy, and I want to keep you on this issue for a moment, Will. As far as you mentioned challenges, and I'm wondering, um, what's keeping you up at night? You mentioned a couple of things. As far as these challenges that currently exist in your specific sector in which you work, and I'm curious how your company is responding to those challenges.
Sure. Two things keep me up at night. One is the interconnection process that I mentioned. It is incredibly competitive, and the studies and the schedule by which entities work really hard to try to get these studies done, to get these projects online, gets delayed more and more every year. It used to be an 18-month process, is now 36, or 36 is 50 months in some instances. And I think that's a combination of there's not enough staff working on these matters at the agencies. There's just so many projects trying to interconnect. And then also, you have so much related infrastructure. Upgrading a transmission line or building a new transmission line can take a decade plus. And so there's just the lack of ability to move power around, or the system to handle all this power coming onto it, keeps me up at night for sure. These are solvable problems, but in longer timeframes than I think developers are used to. And so there's a big bottleneck there, which is unfortunate, but not unexpected. This has been kind of building for a long time. The other one is supply chain, particularly around batteries. There is so much demand for electric vehicles, which is fantastic. There's so much demand for standalone battery energy storage projects, which is fantastic. The manufacturing capacity is honestly having a hard time ramping up to meet it, and also having tier one, really quality tier one manufacturers of batteries. There are the requirements for standalone battery storage. The integration for safety and fire risk and first responder integration is really mission critical, because you can't have a large scale accident at the battery storage level and expect the industry to continue to grow the way it is. I think the public won't have it, regulators won't have it, and so it's really critical to have that tier one manufacturing globally, domestically. I think we all know Tesla; they're a great example. But globally, we need to really grow that, so there's competition in the market, drives prices down, but they're integrating the safety features that are necessary to make sure that these projects can come online and do what they say they're going to do for 20 years, and make sure everyone stays safe along the way.
Yeah, and I think you bring up, obviously those challenges that you brought up, namely interconnection and supply chain. Those are obviously things that we hear about, and those are definitely challenges. And Rich, I'm wondering what that might look like on the distributed generation level. Like, what are you dealing with as far as some of these challenges?
Yeah, I mean, look, so distributed generation can mean a lot of different things. When we're talking about behind the meter, it's obviously this interconnection component is less of an issue than for some of our community solar or small or distributed scale ground mount projects that are front of the meter, where we definitely suffer from the same circumstances. I think that there are potentially some other fixes that could exist that could help mitigate this, but it's not necessarily around how tax law looks at it, placed in service and things like that. But that's sort of just that's putting a Band-Aid over the problem. I think that the major issues around interconnection absolutely are a concern for us, and I think it's sometimes I think it's a matter of saying it's a concern for us as members of the industry. I think it represents a broader risk as a citizen in the United States. I mean, there's a keeping me up at night as a professional in this industry, and then there's a keeping me up at night around cybersecurity and grid resiliency, which must be addressed. And that's one of the things relative to the infrastructure bill and things like FERC 2222 that I'm excited to really see how the United States looks at this moving forward. We every other week we're hearing about pipeline hack or yesterday with JBL with meat processing. That is the American infrastructure, and that's the price of gas going up or the price of beef going up is one thing, but people not having electricity is another. So this is definitely an issue that needs to be addressed, and I think that there needs to be a more FERC-driven approach to how to look at these things, to be able to push the ISOs and the RTOs, and then subsequently down all the way to the utility level, just because it puts a great amount of pressure on groups like ours and Clearway and Strata to be able to manage projects that you can build in 6 or 7 months, but you can't interconnect for 6 or 7 years. So it's definitely an issue.
Yeah, no, you bring up a lot of critical points there. Johana, I'm curious, how are you looking at this from Clearway's perspective as far as tackling some of your challenges?
Yeah, no, for sure. And I'm hearing Will and Rich and what they're saying, and it all brings me to what keeps me up at night and a lot of us, which is kind of our young generations. And the reason why I say that is because there is a problem of staffing. And Will mention that there's a problem of staffing when we interact with some of the authorities having jurisdiction or utilities and people who are helping us and have a role to play in providing permitting, helping interconnection, deployment, authorizations to interconnect. All those steps in our development are critical, not only because they're critical because that's what we need to get the electrons into the grid, but they're critical also because they tie into receipt of capital, for example, or receipt of tax credits. These are tied to critical milestones that the projects need to achieve. And so when I say young generation, it's, bringing more people. And so I spend a lot of my time talking to young people, bringing talent, to join Clearway, but to join our industry in general, because I feel that we have a shortage of people and staff in general. So whether it is within our companies or, within government or at the state or federal level. And so we're very active in that as well. The critical timelines don't depend only on us. They depend on many stakeholders that we're working with very closely. And so this kind of ties all of this together. It ties also the conversation around legislation that we were talking about earlier. There's a plan, which is great, but now there's the implementation of the plan. And so people within our companies, staff, young generations, we all work with our counterparts within government to make it happen. So that's kind of what keeps us at night also a lot, and it ties everything together as well.
Yeah, that's really interesting, actually. You bring up a couple of really critical points there. And Ben, I'd love for you to round out this particular question for us as far as what's keeping you up at night and some of the challenges that you're looking to tackle.
Well, now everybody's taken all my answers, so I'll do my best. I think everybody has hit more or less on the things that keep us up. I think when we're thinking about 2030 goals or 2050 goals, I think that we're all, we have a bunch of smart people that are working on this, and I think we get there. I think, at least personally investing out of a 7-year fund, I'm kind of thinking in that time period or for the next half of a decade, say, we're dealing with a lot of the things that everybody talked about. On the one hand, we are sitting here on the precipice of just a huge explosion, as we said before, of renewable energy development. And, of course, that will also make some of us or some assets a victim of our own success, right? So the interconnection queue is obviously a piece of it. We have partners who are in PJM, who are seeing delays. We have partners who are working in Maine who have been dealing with CMP up there. Sometimes the issue is that you have a utility that wants to stand in the way of development. Sometimes it's just that they're understaffed or lacking in expertise. On the other hand, some markets the bar is set too low for who can enter the queue. So that's obviously something to work on is what is that threshold that allows you to secure queue position. But nonetheless, we as an investor, the mitigant for us is that we have a bit more diversification across a number of markets and a number of companies. I guess everyone on the phone does have access to a bunch of markets as well. And the best thing that you can do is be realistic about timing. So as we're developing projects today in the queue in PJM or in Virginia, we have assets that we know are 2024 or 2025 NTPs. And the best thing you can do is be realistic about it. The other things that we see on the supply chain, we have one of our partners, could have built another 50 megawatts this year, but for steel prices, and so pushed, a number of assets into 22 just because of where that market was. We have folks who are having a tough time in the tight labor market securing EPC availability, let alone the price. Even at the right price, you can't find the labor. So I think over time we're going to be in this kind of tight labor market, especially within our own industry here, where development's just exploding and construction is really ramping up over the next few years. And then the supply chain piece will just get harder and harder because, as we solve, maybe the quote unquote easier issues or the things that we were solving 5-10 years ago, now we're looking at where cobalt comes from, where lithium comes from, where silicon comes from, how modules are sourced. And as we get farther and farther up into the upstream part of the supply chain, I think that'll even further narrow the choices that are either approved by banks and financiers or accepted by kind of the investment community based on ESG standards. And we have our own ESG standards. We have an ESG policy that looks at a number of criteria across those three letters. And there could be concerns, on a number of different levels up into the supply chain. So, I think it's just going to get harder, just like we're seeing today with batteries. It probably won't get easier in the next half a decade.
Yeah, that's a great response. And as you were talking, I'm thinking to myself, wow, you really have to be, when you're in this sector, you really have to be looking at so many different things at one time. And you laid that out really well, from the price of steel, looking at cobalt, like just all these things coming together, talking about FERC policy. So that's really interesting. Ben, I'm going to stay with you now. I want to switch gears a little bit. I want to talk about broader trends and disruptions that you're looking at and you think other people should be looking at too.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I will not claim to be on the cutting edge of anything, but I think that one thing that we're good at, and I think a bunch of folks on the call are good at too, is community solar and kind of looking at alternative forms of revenue contracts. And we're seeing this across our portfolio in a lot of interesting ways. I mean, we have community solar development in Maryland, in New York, group net metering in Maine. We have two different hydro partners. So we have a hydro partner who is working on, working within the group net metering programs in Maine and in New Hampshire. We have a partner in New York who is taking hydro facilities that are, unloved and perhaps merchant or coming to the end of a contract and putting them into VETR, which is New York's way of valuing a kilowatt hour of renewable energy. And so we're kind of at an interesting time where, of course, long-term PPAs are the gold standard and they exist. But there's a lot of kind of, middle ground that we're able to cover by connecting centralized generation to retail load. So I think that's something that is not earth-shattering, but something where we have a lot of access and a lot of expertise, I think, at this point. So, that's probably my main answer as far as what we're involved in that is, I think, somewhat forward-looking at least.
Yeah, thank you. That's really interesting. And Rich, I'd love to turn this over to you.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think from a, the forward-looking part of our day-to-day is less about the the construction of a particular project, though there is actually really fascinating work that's being done on asset optimization, and thinking about how you squeeze more out from an asset, from a revenue standpoint, but also I think that plays into the discussion more generally about commodity pricing and capex, and I think that what's really happening is, with as the industry has matured and the people who are on this phone call have been in it for a long time, it is exceptionally price sensitive. It's and so the optimizations that go from on a software and technology standpoint for minimizing how much steel we put into the ground, and all the way through system design, is definitely more prevalent. For us, really, where I think we will shine, and I think is sort of distributed gen has sort of led the way to a certain extent on some of the more innovative structures. Where we will shine will be around arrangements and thinking that move away from sort of the traditional 10, 15, 20-year PPA, and then a merchant assumption. How we look at broader deployment and evaluating credit, and market dynamics that we can leverage. And then there's sort of the thing that I spend my time reading, because I think it'll be fascinating, and it will be a very, very different world, is the impact of FERC 2222. It'll just be a very different world for how the utilities will interact with distributed resources, in a way that is really addressing what we're talking about from the interconnection standpoint. I mean, I think realistically, even if we wanted to, whether it's a staffing standpoint, on the utility side, whether it's construction labor, whether it's materials availability, we cannot build as much transmission as we need to. So we have to come up with other ways of dealing with this. And the other way to deal with less transmission is managing distributed consumption, managing efficiency, and scheduling. And it is definitely a big part of the conversation. Those deals are harder to do, but what I think you will find is that policy will start to move in a more innovative way of making those types of endeavors more uniform.
Thank you. And Johana, I'm wondering if, Rich and Ben just laid that out for us. I'm wondering if you're seeing some of the same things at Clearway, and just kind of what you're looking out for as far as trends.
Yeah, no, it's very interesting, and I like this topic because when we talk about innovation and disruption, I mean, there's two things. There's the innovation of what we're currently doing and how are we doing it, and there's like little bit by bit we're innovating. So Ben mentioned community solar. That's definitely one big area of our industry, and we were pioneers as well in this. We started in over 5 years ago, and it was a couple of small projects in Colorado, and now we stand today and we have developed over 500 megawatts. But there's always innovation in community solar in the way we community solar, for your listeners, is bringing clean energy directly to the consumer through the grid. So we contract directly with our consumers, with our customers, and the way we contract with our customers has evolved over time, and the requirement from our financiers has evolved over time, and there's innovation constantly on how we structure community solar. And I think that's fascinating because it's a way for people who don't have a roof to get access to clean energy, to renewable energy. And so that's innovation. It's not something that is brand new. because we've been doing community solar for several years, but there's innovation that is required in the way we develop it. So that's one type of trend that we see for sure. And then obviously there's other trend around kind of big disruption, big innovation. Storage is one. And so for now, everything that all of us here are doing is about the more traditional storage solutions that we know. So the ones that we have in our smartphones are the ones that we use on our power plants. But there's dozens of other ways of thinking about storage. So we're keeping an eye on that. And for us, we're interested in the point in time when those new technologies in storage will be at a point where they can be commercialized, bankable. So that's definitely a trend that we see, and I'm looking forward to see other solutions for storage, which will help also, all the topics we were talking about around supply chain and raw material. There's one. Obviously, there's hydrogen, which we haven't talked about yet. It's the big elephant in the room. All companies are creating experts team to get smarter. I'm also very much looking forward for that. I think this is going to be a big trend because it's going also to help us tie to transportation and like this revolution we're talking about. So that's going to be super interesting. And so these two, storage and hydrogen, these are big trends, innovations, disruptions that are coming on top of the kind of small level granular innovations that we do on a day-to-day basis on things like community solar.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And naturally, Will, we've talked about community solar now. I'd love to know what, Strata is looking at as far as, things to look out for around community solar. I know you guys do a lot of that, and storage as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So number one for storage is making sure that, because it is somewhat of a nascent resource still, is making sure that the utilities are modeling it correctly in their integrated resource plan, right? If they're not, it's easy to dismiss if they're working with a cost curve from 3 years ago, or they're not understanding some of the dynamics on use case or other things like that. So there is a lot of mad science, so to speak, that's still involved with designing these projects, making sure they're serving the needs. And also, if you want to buy some batteries and you'd like them to last for 20 years, it's an entirely different use case than if you want to buy some batteries and have them last 8 or 10 years. And so you really got to understand that. You got to model that. You got to make sure the utilities has the pricing around that. So, and we're seeing, I think, incredible progress on that, but there's still always work to be done, making sure that the pricing in the industry is moving so fast, and the utility integrated resource plan process, just by its nature, tends to be pretty slow, sometimes a multi-year process. Making sure those inputs are as up to date as possible is really imperative for the industry. And I think that the trade associations, whether it's SEIA or ESA or ACP or the local trade associations, being involved in those IRP processes are really, really important. And now you're seeing, just the other day, SEIA came out with a kind of a wing focused just on storage, and ESA is focused just on storage, and ACP is focused on utility scale wind and solar and storage. And so, it's right there in the mix with everybody. On the solar standpoint, from the solar standpoint, it really, the big factors are supply chain. There was a mention earlier about, where particularly polysilicon is coming from. There's been, rightfully so, a lot of attention brought to some of the labor practices overseas and whether those need to be addressed. And I think what you're going to end up seeing is a lot more transparency in supply chain, similar to the transparency in supply chain on storage, where, where's the cobalt coming from? What are the labor practices to do that? And these are hard conversations to have. They probably will have short-term cost impacts on the industry, but long-term, these are the right things to do to make sure that the industry is growing in a just way, up and down, not just for consumers, but for everyone involved. And so that will likely impact pricing a little bit. And then there continues to be innovation, at the panel level, where you've got bifacial panels now, which are incredible, particularly in certain environments. You've got improved racking technologies, which are fantastic. And then just general efficiency with EPC. When I started in the industry, you had to put a panel on with 6 to 8 brackets, and now a panel can get clipped on with 2 brackets, and so that's just that much less aluminum and steel you need, that much less labor you need, and you're still getting the same quality product. I mean, it's just learning along the way, and so I think you're going to continue to see that. And so, in terms of areas that are exciting, there was a mention of green hydrogen, a lot of attention there, particularly if we see some action at the federal level to help incentivize that. I think there's a lot of growth potential there to ensure that manufacturing is utilizing clean energy, advancement of distributed resources, participating in the wholesale market, stringing together communities as kind of virtual power plants, seeing more and more of that in the markets. Energy efficiency aggregation, I think, is really cool. Starting to see a lot more of that. And overall, so the amount of investment coming into the industry, both kind of your traditional private equity, infrastructure investment, and then also really seeing a resurgence of that venture capital money as well, technology space, software plays in the industry, is really growing it across the board, both for consumers directly as well as utilities, and of course corporates right in the middle with Google, a great example. I believe it was Google saying that they're going to adjust their cloud such that if you're tasking your cloud with doing something that's energy intensive, it will actually delay that until there's renewable energy being utilized. And so they're kind of almost like time of use, but for data centers, to ensure that you're relying more on renewables instead of brown power. And so I think that's pretty fantastic on their path, and Facebook's path, and Apple's, all the big tech, Amazon, all the big tech companies' path to be relying on renewable energy at all their data centers and through their operations, and then through their supply chain.
Yeah, we're definitely hearing a lot of that, which is really great and encouraging to hear. Will, I'd like to stay with you for a moment and switch gears to COVID recovery. Obviously it's been quite a year and a half, and I'm wondering how you see the renewable energy space, how you see that in the context of COVID recovery going forward.
By and large, the renewable energy space, the clean energy space, did fairly well through COVID. And perfect example of the long lead time infrastructure projects, patient investment. And while there was various changes, short-term changes in energy demand, you're seeing across the board energy demand going up, particularly in areas where there's incredible new growth. Texas, Desert Southwest, elsewhere. And so I think the industry actually fared pretty well through 2020 and hit 2021 at a pretty healthy pace that is positioning the industry to grow. There are, you just look on LinkedIn, there are an enormous number of openings across the board at all levels of the industry for all types of roles. The recruitment space in clean energy is booming right now. There's an incredible amount of money, particularly with the international oil super majors coming in and all investing very, very heavily in the U.S. Domestic renewable space. So I think the industry is poised to put COVID in the rearview mirror and really help this economy at a macro level be one of the leaders, the leading growth stories coming out of COVID that helps rebuild this economy nationally. And then at a state level, pretty much everywhere. I can't think of one state right now that is not incredibly hot and busy on renewables. Putting aside, political pundits and some headlines, there's activity in all 50 states without question.
Well, that's really good to hear. And Ben, I'm curious, is that what you're seeing and feeling as far as sustainable investments, clean energy investments? Does it look good?
Yeah, for sure. And I'll just echo the last point about just kind of looking across the U.S. I think we've invested as a firm in over 30 states. So we're not in 50, but agreed that stuff's going on all over the place. We have some solar farms in Wyoming and Montana now. These are states that, historically we haven't really been talking about in the context of renewables. But yeah, look, I think going through 2020, there was all sorts of articles about renewables being the calm in the storm or being a safe haven. And I think if anything, the asset class benefited through COVID. We as a firm saw increased capital inflows as a result because folks saw that the assets were doing what they said they were going to do. I mean, other than perhaps a near-term kind of reduction in load growth, people were home using their screens and using a bunch of power. So, I think it was generally an okay pandemic for the industry, other than having construction, shut down for a period of time. I think coming out of this, clearly it is, looking back to the New Deal and just things like that. I mean, it's a great way to rebuild the economy is get folks working, in this industry. So I think it's all coming together. An economic crisis that needs digging out of, combined with, like I was talking about earlier, the ESG demands, for climate focused investments. Legislation that we're seeing at both the state and federal level, and just the economic parity of a lot of these technologies. So I think coming out of this, if anything, similar to our comments about the interconnection queue, there will be some choppy waters when it comes to a tight labor market. That's a labor market that affects building a project and needing EPC labor. It affects us as an investment team, looking for associates. It's probably hitting everybody, and then same with materials. You can hardly build a house right now, and I think some of that material inflation could hit parts of the balance of system for some of the things that we're doing. So, long term, the future is looking good. I think 2020, the last 12 months were more or less fine, and short term, there could be disruptions from a labor and supply chain perspective, but overall, I think, as we know, the administration is going to try to use this industry as a way to rebuild out of the economic environment.
Sure, absolutely. Rich, I'd love to hear you on this.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, from the COVID standpoint, to Ben's comment about, the industry, the interest in the industry. I mean, we have over 150 projects across something like 70 different off-takers, ranging from, Walmart to a mausoleum that's operated as part of an archdiocese, and in New Jersey, and we had a total of 0 defaults throughout all of COVID. And I think that a lot of that goes to just what renewables are doing, right? Renewables, particularly in distributed generation, but anywhere that they're being deployed, they're saving people money. So it ultimately makes sense to pay that bill relative to the alternative. The supply components of this will slow down. Those pressures will alleviate. I think that there might be a different attitude towards the just-in-time manufacturing perspective around renewables, because realistically, I think what is a really great signal for manufacturers that this is a sustainable, prolonged demand. You don't necessarily need to worry about, if you're a panel manufacturer, whether or not there's going to be market growth. There will be market growth. If you're an inverter manufacturer, racking, whatever else, I mean, you understand that it becomes less subject to policy whim, at which point maintaining a large inventory would not make economic sense, to a world where that it's actually going to hurt your business to the extent that you don't have that capacity available. And just, if you sort of think about the psychological impact of that for the people, like us that have been in the industry for so long, I mean, we were always bullish about growth, but this is just a different level than I think probably any of us expected within the time frame. And so it's exciting to see, and I think that it will change the industry more positively to come. But it will definitely be it'll be a rough, I think, 18 months, 18 to 24 months from an execution standpoint.
Yeah, you lay that out really well, and it sounds like there's a lot to feel optimistic about, but there could be some rough patches ahead. Obviously, Johana, I'm curious how Clearway is looking at the space as we kind of hopefully are rounding the bed in COVID recovery.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything that was said around. If anything, our managed to do well during the pandemic. And so apart from construction shutdowns and construction delays in some geographies, it's a business that is that takes time. So you're preparing, you're developing, preparing, building it. It takes a lot of time, and so that episode of COVID, even though it appeared to be very long to all of us, kind of, our industry kind of just managed it. Some issues around supply chain, some issues around construction, but overall coming out strong, and coming out also as a population with some more awareness about what we do, I think. Awareness about our impact on the planet, our impact on climate, our impact on wildlife. So all those themes were talked about during COVID, and I think that's great, and that helps us. So I'm trying to see the good in what has happened in terms of bringing awareness on what we do. So coming out of COVID, there's challenges that are related to shortages in general, shortages of people, shortages of some raw material and supply chain. So those shortages will have to be overcome through investment. But we see tremendous opportunity. So we're hoping for the best, that everything's behind us, and that we can continue to grow. One thing that Ben mentioned, and he kind of tie that to capital. We see a lot of capital that is going to be allocated to our industry. A tremendous amount of private capital, in addition to obviously government plans. And there's a lot of capital, but not a lot of good projects. And so the capital is going to need to rethink about how they invest. They're going to need to act more like VC. They're going to need to, foray into other types of technologies, other types of projects, things that are a bit more earlier stage, all those themes, and that's going to help our industry. So, we were talking a little bit about capital earlier. I think this is great because there's a lot of capital, but so the capital itself is going to need to think about how investments are made and the criteria to kind of expand more and be active earlier. So I'm looking forward to see that as well.
That's great. Thank you. You all touch on some really great points. And finally, I want to end off with this. I want to ask each one of you, if you got a chance to sit down one-on-one with President Biden, I'm curious, what kind of support would you ask for in relation to your specific sectors? And whoever wants to start us off on this one, please feel free.
I mean, I'll say, the goal is amazing. The plans are great. Continue to communicate, and educate people, because education is key to what we do, and we need people, we need staff, we need support from the general population. And so I'd say, just please spend the amount of time and the amount of money that is needed to continue educating people.
Sure, absolutely. Ben?
Sure. Yeah. If he and I were chatting and he, knew where he was and what was going on, I would tell him, I just don't want to see some of the entrenched and more accepted technologies go the way of oil and gas, where the subsidies far outlast the usefulness or the time at which they were critical. And so to make sure that in a world where putting dollars into federal subsidies is a zero-sum game, and he's always going to be fighting for what he can subsidize and whatnot, to let subsidies fall away, even sometimes if it's a little early in people's minds, to make sure that those same dollars, if it is a zero-sum game, go into what is next. So that again, 20 years from now, solar is not the oil and gas, still getting subsidized by whatever process in Washington causes that to happen.
Makes sense. Good ask so far. Well,
I think I'd want to get some feedback on him on how the industry can continue to be equitable, and maybe it's just messaging, but making sure that a big part of the country that is not necessarily his constituency benefits immensely from wind and is starting to benefit immensely from solar, and just trying to find a way in which that message can be better understood, better heard, better relayed, so that people realize that this is actually, the renewable energy, clean energy growth throughout the United States is not just benefiting a very small group of people and not just benefiting people that may have voted for him, but it's actually supporting everyone. And so figuring out a better way to do that is something I'd want to talk to him about.
Sure, absolutely. And finally, Rich.
But I'm sure Rich has something super interesting to say.
Rich, I think we might be frozen.
It looks frozen.
Yeah, it happens during every virtual panel that I've been on, for sure. Okay, well, you know what? That just means that we all have to meet again and come back again for a second panel. So I'm holding you all to that. And thank you so much again, all of you. What a great conversation, really insightful and interesting. That wraps us up for today. Just huge thank you and kudos to our talented panel. We look forward to having you all back. And also I want to thank all of our attendees. We really hope you enjoyed the conversation, and please stay tuned for future NPM interconnection forums. Thank you all. Hello, and welcome to